At 3:47 in the morning, Corporal James Harland stood beside a piece of equipment he was forbidden to fire alone, watching 7 enemy trucks arrange themselves into a formation designed to kill everyone he was supposed to protect. He had orders. Clear orders. Do not engage. Maintain radio silence. Observe and report. And in 90 minutes, when the sun came up, a convoy carrying ammunition for 3 infantry companies would drive straight into that ambush unless someone broke every rule that kept armies from tearing themselves apart. 1 man, 1 gun, 1 decision that Doctrine said he had no right to make. The fog came in low that night, the kind that turned the Burmese hill country into something formless and suffocating. It rolled up from the valleys and thick banks, settling into the creases of the terrain like water finding its level, and it carried with it the smell of wet vegetation and mud and something else, something faintly metallic that might have been the river or might have been the residue of old violence soaked into the earth. Harland had been awake for 19 hours. His position was a shallow depression carved into the hillside overlooking the southeastern approach to Leto Road, a supply route that connected the forward staging areas near Mykdala to the rear depots that kept the entire 14th Army functioning. The position itself was nothing elaborate. A few sandbags arranged in a low semicircle, a camouflage net that did more to trap moisture than conceal anything. The M116 pack howitzer squatting on its trail legs like some patient, mechanical insect. The gun was a compromise weapon, a 75mm piece designed to be broken down and carried by mule when the roads gave out, which they always did. It could fire a high-explosive shell just over 9,000 yards if you elevated the tube high enough and the wind cooperated and you didn't mind where it landed. At closer ranges, with decent visibility and a trained crew, it was accurate enough to matter. The British called it adequate. The Americans called it portable. Everyone who had to use one called it better than nothing, which in February 1945, in the wet hills east of the Irrawaddy, was the highest praise most equipment earned. Harland's crew was gone. Not dead, not missing, just gone in the particular way that armies lose people without drama or ceremony. Dysentery had taken Private Simmons and Private DeMarco 4 days earlier, the kind of aggressive intestinal rebellion that turned men into hollow, dehydrated shadows in less than 48 hours. They were currently recovering in a field hospital 30 miles south, which might as well have been another continent for all the good it did him. Private Chun had developed a fever that same night, the sort that came with chills and delirium and a glazed look in the eyes that meant malaria or typhus or one of a dozen other things that thrived in this climate. He'd been evacuated at dawn. The 4th member of the crew, Corporal Ortiz, had been reassigned to a mortar team after their own gunner took shrapnel from a Japanese knee mortar 2 weeks back. Command had promised replacements. Command always promised replacements. None had arrived. So Harland sat alone with a weapon that required 4 men to operate effectively, under orders that assumed he had those men, in a position that overlooked a road where nothing was supposed to happen. His orders were specific. Observe enemy movement. Report via radio at 0600 hours unless circumstances required breaking silence, which they were strongly discouraged from requiring. Do not engage unless directly attacked. Do not reveal the position. Standard reconnaissance doctrine, the kind that made sense when you had other positions, other guns, other ways to respond if something went wrong. The orders assumed a functioning system. They assumed communication. They assumed time. The Japanese trucks appeared at 3:32. Harland spotted them through the binoculars, 7 dark shapes moving without headlights along a parallel track that ran roughly northeast before intersecting Leto Road about 800 yards from his position. Type 97 trucks, 6-wheelers with canvas covers and the distinctive angular cab that made them easy to identify even in poor light. They moved slowly, carefully, like men who knew the ground and didn't want to announce themselves. They stopped at intervals that looked random until you understood what you were seeing. Harland understood. He'd spent 8 months in Burma. He'd watched the Japanese operate. They were methodical. They were patient. They very rarely wasted time. The first truck stopped at a point where the road curved slightly and a stand of teak trees created a natural blind. The second positioned itself 70 yards further back, near a drainage ditch that would provide cover and a clear line of fire down the road. The third moved to the opposite side, tucking itself into a position that gave it overlapping angles with the second. 4 5 and 6 spread themselves along a 400-yard stretch in a pattern that wasn't quite geometric but was absolutely deliberate. The 7th truck remained mobile, positioned to block or pursue. It was a textbook ambush formation, the kind that appeared in training manuals because it worked. Interlocking fields of fire, multiple fallback positions, sufficient spacing to prevent one artillery strike from eliminating the entire element. Someone in command of those trucks had done this before. Harland lowered the binoculars and checked his watch. 3:47. In approximately 2 hours and 13 minutes, the convoy from the southern depot was scheduled to pass through this sector. 43 trucks carrying artillery ammunition, medical supplies, and rations for forward units that were already running low. He knew this because he'd been part of the guard detail when the convoy assembled 2 days ago, before his crew collapsed, and he'd been reassigned to this position as a temporary measure that stopped being temporary the moment everyone else got sick. The convoy would be moving at dawn because that's when convoys moved, when you had enough light to see the road but the Japanese air assets were less likely to be active. It would come up Leto Road from the south, following the standard route, at a speed of maybe 15 miles per hour on the rough sections. When it reached the curve where those trucks were positioning themselves, it would be vulnerable for at least 90 seconds, probably closer to 2 minutes given the terrain. 2 minutes was an eternity in an ambush. Harland looked at the radio. It was a SCR 300 backpack set, 35 pounds of vacuum tubes and batteries and theoretical communication range. The theoretical part was important. In good conditions, on flat ground, with clear line of sight and minimal atmospheric interference, the SCR 300 could reliably transmit about 3 miles. In hills, in fog, with the ionosphere doing whatever the ionosphere did at night, that range collapsed. The nearest command post was at least 4 miles away, possibly 5 depending on which unit was actually staffing it tonight. He could try. He could break radio silence, call it in, hope someone heard him, hope they had the authority to make a decision, hope they made it fast enough to matter. Standard Doctrine said that's exactly what he should do. Doctrine also said he shouldn't be here alone. Doctrine said a lot of things that stopped applying the moment reality became complicated. He ran the numbers. Assume the radio worked and someone heard him. Assume they believed him, which wasn't guaranteed because reports of enemy activity had been wrong before and nobody wanted to commit resources based on one soldier's interpretation of headlights in the dark. Assume they decided to act. What could they do? Divert the convoy. Possible. But the alternate routes added hours and ran through areas that hadn't been cleared in days. Send a patrol to investigate? Also possible, but patrols took time to organize and the Japanese would see them coming. Artillery support? From where? The nearest battery that could range this area was positioned to support a different sector and would need to displace, which meant at least an hour, probably 2. And all of that assumed instant communication, instant decisions, instant execution. The army didn't work that way. Nothing worked that way. Systems had lag time. The more complex the system, the more lag. The fog thickened. Harland could barely see the road now. Just vague shapes and the occasional hint of movement when something darker passed in front of something less dark. The Japanese were settling in, making their adjustments, running their own calculations. Professional soldiers doing professional work. In different circumstances, he might have admired the competence. Tonight, it just made the problem worse. These weren't opportunistic raiders. They weren't a patrol that happened to be in the wrong place. They were here deliberately, positioned specifically, waiting for something they expected to arrive. Which meant intelligence. Which meant planning. Which meant this wasn't going to resolve itself if he just waited and hoped they'd leave. He considered the Howitzer. The M116 was not designed to be operated by one person. Loading a 75mm shell required lifting 35 pounds of high explosive from the ammunition storage, carrying it to the breech, aligning it properly, and ramming it home with enough force to seat it correctly but not so much force that you damaged the propellant case. Then you closed the breech, verified the firing mechanism was set, aimed the gun using both traverse and elevation wheels while checking the sight picture, and fired. After firing, you opened the breech, cleared the empty case, and started the process again. A trained crew could do this in 30 to 40 seconds. One man, working carefully, would need at least 90 seconds per shot, probably longer. And that was assuming nothing went wrong. Assuming the recoil didn't jar something loose. assuming he didn't miss a step and jam the breech, assuming he could physically manage the repetitive loading while maintaining enough awareness to adjust aim between rounds. Artillery doctrine was explicit. Never fire alone. The rule existed for good reasons. A lone gunner couldn't observe his own fall of shot effectively, couldn't adjust fire quickly, couldn't maintain sustained fire long enough to matter, couldn't defend the position if someone came looking for the source of incoming rounds, couldn't call for help if something went catastrophically wrong. The doctrine assumed you'd always have a crew or you wouldn't have a gun. It didn't account for nights when the crew was gone and the gun was all you had. Harland checked his watch again. 3:59. He did the math one more time, slower, making sure he wasn't missing something. Radio call. 2 minutes to make contact, assuming it worked. Report. 3 minutes to explain the situation clearly enough that someone took it seriously. Decision cycle. Optimistically, 5 minutes. Realistically, 15 or more. Response time. Anywhere from 30 minutes to never, depending on what assets were available and whether anyone believed the threat was real. Total elapsed time from right now. Absolute minimum 40 minutes. Likely over an hour. Dawn was at 0600 hours. The convoy would pass shortly after. The arithmetic was simple and unforgiving. Protocol couldn't save them. The system couldn't move fast enough. He stood up slowly, his knees protesting after hours in the same position. The howitzer sat there waiting, indifferent to doctrine or authorization or the proper chain of command. It was a tool. It had a trigger and a sight and a barrel that pointed wherever you aimed it. The ammunition was stacked in wooden crates to his left, each shell nested in packing material that smelled faintly of grease and wood shavings. He had 23 high-explosive rounds. More than enough if he made them count. Completely insufficient if he didn't. This was the choice. Follow orders that no longer matched reality and watch men die because he followed procedure. Or violate every regulation that kept armies functional and hope that his judgment in this moment, alone in the dark with incomplete information, was better than the collective wisdom of the doctrine he was about to ignore. There was no third option. The fog and the timing and the terrain had eliminated everything else. Harland moved to the ammunition crates and opened the first one. The shells lay nested in their protective packing, each one identical, each one 64 millimeters of casing and explosive that would detonate on impact and send fragments radiating outward at velocities that turned sheet metal into lace. He lifted one out carefully, feeling the weight of it, the cold metal against his hands. This was real. This was not theory or training or something you could undo if it went wrong. Once he fired, everything changed. The position would be compromised. The Japanese would know someone was out here. Command would know he'd violated orders. And if he was wrong, if those trucks were something else or the convoy had been rerouted or his judgment in this moment was simply mistaken, then he'd have started a firefight for nothing and painted a target on a position he couldn't defend. He carried the shell to the breech and loaded it. The mechanism was smooth, well-maintained despite the conditions. The shell seated properly. He closed the breech and moved to the site. The Japanese trucks were still there, visible now only as interruptions in the fog, dark masses that marked where the ambush would unfold. He needed to hit the first truck, the one positioned at the curve. If he disabled that, it would block the road and create confusion. The others would react, probably pull back, maybe abandon the position entirely if they thought they were under organized fire rather than just one lunatic with a howitzer. He adjusted the elevation, cranked the traverse wheel, checked the sight picture. 800 yards, slight downward angle, negligible wind. The mathematics of trajectory were straightforward. You pointed the barrel, compensated for distance and drop, and fired. What happened after that was physics and luck in roughly equal measure. Harland pulled the lanyard. The howitzer fired with a flat crack that seemed too loud and too small at the same time, a violent percussion that hammered the air and sent the gun rocking back on its trail. The shell arced out into the darkness. Invisible, just a brief whistle of displaced air and then nothing. He was already moving, opening the breech, clearing the empty casing, reaching for the next round. He didn't see the impact, but he heard it, a sharp crump of detonation somewhere down by the road, and then he saw the brief flash of fire through the fog. Hit or near miss, he couldn't tell, but it was close enough. The Japanese would be reacting now, trying to locate the source, trying to decide whether to advance or withdraw or return fire. He loaded the second shell faster, not rushing but not wasting motion either. Each step had to be precise. Fumble the loading and you could jam the breech. Miss the alignment and the shell might not detonate properly. Artillery was methodical work even when people weren't trying to kill you. Alone, under pressure, it became a kind of meditation. Focus on the next step. Only the next step. Let everything else disappear. The second shot went out with the same flat crack, the same violent recoil. This one he adjusted slightly, aiming for where the second truck should be based on his earlier observation. Another detonation, this one accompanied by something larger, something that suggested he'd hit the truck itself or maybe detonated ammunition. Hard to tell through the fog. He loaded again. Third shell. Fourth. Fifth. He fell into a rhythm, each cycle of loading and aiming and firing taking perhaps 70 seconds, maybe 80. His shoulders began to ache from the repetitive lifting. His hands were filthy with powder residue and grease. Sweat ran down his face despite the cold. None of it mattered. He kept firing. The Japanese started pulling back after the sixth or seventh shot. He couldn't see them clearly, but he could tell from the way the return fire stopped and the quality of the sounds changed. Engines starting. Vehicles moving. The distinctive grinding of trucks trying to maneuver in difficult terrain. They were withdrawing, abandoning the position, taking their wounded if they had any and leaving their dead if they couldn't recover them. Standard doctrine when you couldn't locate the source of incoming fire and didn't have the assets to suppress it. Better to pull back, reassess, try again another time. He fired 3 more rounds anyway, spacing them along the likely withdrawal route, not trying to hit anything specific, just making sure they kept moving and didn't decide to circle back and investigate. The ammunition expenditure felt wasteful, but certainty was expensive and he needed them gone, completely gone, before the convoy arrived. After the 10th shot, maybe the 11th, he stopped. The howitzer sat there smoking slightly, the barrel hot enough that he could feel the heat radiating from it when he stood close. His ears rang with a flat, persistent tone that would probably last for hours. His hands shook slightly, not from fear or adrenaline but from simple muscular fatigue. Operating a crew-served weapon alone was brutally physical work. The fog began to thin around 5:30 as the temperature differential changed and the air started to move. Harland stayed at the position, watching the road, listening for any indication that the Japanese were regrouping or returning. Nothing moved. The dawn came slowly, gray light seeping into the landscape without drama or beauty, just the gradual revelation of what had always been there. At 6:14, the convoy appeared from the south, 43 trucks moving in the patient, cautious way that military vehicles moved when they expected trouble but hoped to avoid it. They passed through the ambush site without stopping, without even slowing, completely unaware that anything had happened. Harland watched them go. Nobody looked up at his position. Nobody waved. The trucks just kept moving, carrying their ammunition and supplies forward to men who would use them without ever knowing how close they'd come to not receiving them at all. He filed the radio report at 0600 exactly, keeping it brief and factual. Enemy activity observed. Ambush position identified. Position engaged and neutralized. Convoy passed safely. The transmission went through on the second try, the signal finally finding enough atmospheric cooperation to carry 4 miles. The voice on the other end acknowledged receipt and asked him to stand by for instructions. He waited. 20 minutes later, they told him to maintain position until relieved. Standard procedure. Someone would come investigate, confirm his report, decide what to do about it. The patrol arrived around 1000 hours. A squad of infantry with a lieutenant who looked maybe 23 and deeply uncertain about how to handle what he was seeing. They found the destroyed trucks. 5 definitively disabled, 2 probably mobile but abandoned, scattered along the road in positions that made their purpose obvious to anyone who understood tactics. They found shell fragments. They found blood trails. They found evidence of hasty evacuation and equipment left behind when speed mattered more than recovering assets. The lieutenant took notes, made his own report, asked Harland careful questions about timeline and authorization, and whether he'd received any orders beyond the standard reconnaissance brief. Harland answered honestly. No additional orders.
No authorization.
Just judgment and mathematics and a howitzer that happened to be in the right place. The lieutenant didn't say much after that. He filed his report and left, taking his squad with him, and Harland went back to waiting. The relief crew showed up that afternoon, for artillerymen who'd been pulled from another position to take over. They were professional and efficient and didn't ask questions about the spent shell casings or the obvious signs that someone had been working the gun hard. Harland briefed them on the position, the sight lines, the likely avenues of approach, all the standard information you passed along. Then he gathered his gear and walked back to the rear area to wait for whatever came next. What came next was nothing. No formal inquiry, no commendation, no court-martial, nothing. His report was filed alongside 1,000 other reports from 1,000 other positions where men made decisions under conditions that didn't fit neatly into Doctrine. The convoy had arrived safely. The enemy position had been neutralized. The 14th Army continued its advance toward Mykdala and then Rangoon without losing momentum because the logistics train kept functioning. From the perspective of the larger campaign, it was a footnote. One avoided ambush among dozens of actual ambushes, hundreds of skirmishes, thousands of small violent encounters that collectively determined whether an army could keep moving or ground to a halt. Success left no evidence. The convoy that didn't get destroyed, the supplies that arrived on time, the casualties that never happened, these things generated no paperwork, no after-action reports with dramatic lessons learned. Only failure was visible. Only failure demanded explanation. Harland's company commander spoke to him once, briefly, 2 days later. A short conversation in a field tent that smelled of mildew and diesel fuel. The commander asked if Harland understood that he'd violated standing orders. Harland said he did. The commander asked if Harland would do the same thing again under similar circumstances. Harland thought about it for a moment and said yes, probably. The commander nodded slowly, made a notation in a file that Harland couldn't see, and dismissed him. That was the end of it.
No acknowledgement. No consequences.
Just the bureaucratic silence that settles over events that are too complicated to punish and too irregular to praise. The war continued without him in any significant way. His crew eventually recovered and reassembled, minus Ortiz who stayed with the mortar team. They worked other positions, fired other missions, followed other orders that sometimes made sense and sometimes didn't. Harland rotated back to rear area duties after Burma, spent time in India, eventually shipped home when the war ended and the great machinery of demobilization began processing millions of men back into civilian life. He returned to Pennsylvania, to a town that looked smaller than he remembered, to a job at a furniture factory that paid adequately and required no particular judgment beyond measuring accurately and cutting straight. He didn't talk about Leto Road. Nobody asked. The war stories people wanted to hear were about battles with names, campaigns that appeared in newspapers, moments that fit into the narrative of victory that everyone was building together. An artillery position in Burma where nothing officially happened didn't make the cut. The years accumulated quietly. Marriage, children, the slow progression of ordinary life unfolding in ways that would have seemed impossible during the war when every moment carried the weight of potential violence. He thought about that night sometimes, usually when he couldn't sleep, usually in the early morning hours when the house was silent and his mind wandered to places it didn't go during the day. He thought about the decision, the calculations, the certainty he'd felt in that moment that breaking the rules was the only thing that made sense. He wondered if he'd been right or if he'd just been lucky, and whether there was actually any meaningful difference between the two. He wondered what happened to the Japanese soldiers in those trucks, whether they'd survived his artillery fire or died in the fog, never knowing who was shooting at them or why. He wondered if the men in that convoy ever learned how close they'd come to disaster, or if they'd just driven past his position in the gray dawn and thought nothing of it because danger avoided feels like safety earned. What troubled him, in those quiet hours, wasn't the violence itself. War was violence. You accepted that or you broke. What troubled him was the realization that systems couldn't see what he'd seen. Doctrine couldn't adapt fast enough. The rules that kept armies functional were also the rules that sometimes killed people who followed them too rigidly. And there was no way to fix this. No way to write a regulation that said, use your judgment without creating chaos. No way to define the circumstances under which breaking orders was correct without making all orders meaningless. You needed discipline. You needed structure. You needed men to follow instructions even when they didn't understand the reasons because war was too complex and too fast for everyone to make independent decisions. But you also needed men who could recognize the moments when the system failed, when the gap between what doctrine assumed and what reality delivered became too large to ignore. And there was no training for that. No manual. Just individual human judgment exercised in isolation with incomplete information and consequences that rippled outward in ways you couldn't predict. He thought about the lieutenant who'd investigated the position, the careful way he'd asked questions, the way he'd looked at Harland like he was trying to solve a problem that didn't have a good answer. The lieutenant had been caught between competing imperatives. Acknowledge that Harland had probably saved 43 trucks and everyone in them, or acknowledge that Harland had violated direct orders and created a precedent that could unravel discipline if enough people decided their judgment trumped their instructions. Both things were true. Both things mattered. The lieutenant had chosen to file a report and move on, which was probably the only reasonable choice available. Sometimes you couldn't resolve contradictions. You just lived with them. The invisible nature of it stayed with him longest. Nobody would remember Leto Road. No memorial would mark the spot. No history would record that on February 14, 1945, at approximately 3:47 in the morning, one man with one gun made one decision that kept a convoy from being destroyed. The absence of disaster generated no stories. The men who'd been in those trucks went on with their lives, delivered their supplies, fought their battles, came home or didn't come home based on other factors in other places. They never knew Harland existed. They had no reason to. From their perspective, nothing had happened. They'd driven down a road and reached their destination safely, exactly as expected. Only Harland knew how close it had been. Only he carried the weight of that knowledge, and even for him, it became lighter with time, worn down by the accumulation of years and other concerns until it was just one memory among many, notable mainly for its strangeness. He understood, eventually, that this was how most of war actually worked. The famous battles and heroic stands were real, but they were outliers. Most of the war was logistics and paperwork and a million small decisions made by people whose names would never appear in any official history. Convoys that arrived. Supplies that reached the front. Equipment that got repaired. Messages that were transmitted correctly. Artillery positions that stayed alert even when nothing seemed to be happening. The vast invisible infrastructure that kept armies functional long enough to reach the moments that everyone remembered. Success was boring. Success meant things worked the way they were supposed to work, and nobody thought about it. Only failure was interesting. Only disaster demanded explanation. And maybe that was fine. Maybe that was even correct. The men in that convoy had gone on to do important things, fight important battles, contribute to an outcome that mattered. If his decision that night had enabled any of that, if his violation of orders had kept the logistics chain functional for even one more day, then it had been worth it regardless of whether anyone ever knew. The work didn't require recognition. It just required being done. Harland died in 1987, peacefully, in a hospital in Allentown, surrounded by family who loved him and thought he'd lived a good and ordinary life. His obituary mentioned his service in Burma briefly, the way obituaries do, just a line about his time in the army during World War II. No details. No battles. Just acknowledgement that he'd been there and come home. They buried him in a cemetery on a hillside overlooking the Lehigh Valley, a place with trees and grass and a view that reminded no one of anything in particular. A few dozen people attended the funeral. They remembered him as a decent man. Quiet, reliable. Someone who'd worked hard and raised his family and hadn't caused trouble. Which was true. All of it was true. And on a hillside in Burma, if anyone bothered to look, they might still find fragments of shell casings scattered in the dirt near a road that probably doesn't exist anymore, or exists under a different name, connecting places that matter for different reasons now. The Howitzer position is long gone, reclaimed by vegetation, invisible. The trucks were hauled away or left to rust decades ago. No marker indicates that anything happened there. And that's fine. That's how it should be. Some victories don't need monuments. Some decisions don't need vindication. They just need to have been made when they mattered by someone who was there, who saw what needed to be done and did it even though Doctrine said he shouldn't. The system couldn't see what he saw, couldn't move fast enough, couldn't adapt. And so one man, alone with a gun he wasn't supposed to fire, made a choice that saved lives by ignoring every rule designed to protect them, and then went home and never mentioned it because what was there to say? He'd done his job. That was enough. The fog that morning had been thick and cold and impenetrable, the kind that made you feel isolated even when you knew other people were close by. It had burned off by noon, the way fog always does in that climate, revealing terrain that looked ordinary in daylight. Hills and roads and trees, nothing special, nothing worth remembering. Just another piece of Burma in February 1945, indistinguishable from 1,000 other pieces of Burma where men made decisions and lived or died based on factors too complex to calculate in advance. The Japanese trucks had been real. The ambush had been real. The threat had been immediate and concrete and exactly the kind of thing that planning tried to anticipate and usually failed to prevent. And one soldier, operating outside Doctrine, outside authorization, outside the protective structure of the system that was supposed to keep armies functional, had recognized what was happening and stopped it. Not with heroism in any traditional sense. Not with courage or sacrifice or any of the qualities that appear in citations and histories. Just with competence and judgment and a willingness to accept the consequences of being wrong. He'd made the calculation. He'd evaluated the risk. He'd acted. And 43 trucks full of ammunition and medicine and food had reached their destination on time, allowing other men to fight other battles, which allowed the campaign to continue, which contributed in some small unmeasurable way to an outcome that eventually ended the war. Invisible cause. Invisible effect. The kind of decision that shaped history without leaving any evidence it had happened at all. That's what Harland understood in those quiet morning hours when sleep wouldn't come and his mind returned to Leto Road despite his best efforts to think about other things. He understood that wars were decided as much by what didn't happen as by what did. The ambushes that failed. The supplies that arrived. The convoys that passed safely because someone, somewhere, violated orders at exactly the right moment in exactly the right way. And nobody would ever know, because success looked like normalcy and normalcy didn't generate stories. The only way anyone would have heard about Leto Road was if he'd followed orders, maintained radio silence, waited for authorization that came too late, and watched 43 trucks drive into a kill zone that erased them in minutes. Then there would have been investigations and reports and lessons learned and all the apparatus that armies deployed to understand failure. His name might even have appeared in some file, mentioned as the observer who'd reported enemy activity but hadn't engaged, a footnote to a disaster. But he hadn't followed orders. He'd trusted his judgment over Doctrine. And so nothing happened. The convoy passed. The war continued. And James Harland went home to Pennsylvania and lived an ordinary life and took his invisible victory to the grave, where it remains unmarked and unremembered, like most of the decisions that actually mattered. If you found value in this story, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe to the channel and leave a like on this video. These forgotten moments of individual judgment deserve to be remembered, even when they left no official record. And I want to ask you something. If you'd been Corporal Harland that night, alone with that gun, watching those trucks position themselves for an ambush, what would you have done? Would you have followed the order to maintain radio silence and wait for authorization, trusting that the system would respond in time? Or would you have trusted your own judgment, violated Doctrine, and fired anyway? There's no easy answer. Both choices carry risk. Both choices have consequences. But in that moment, on that hillside, one man had to decide. What would your decision have been?